June 12th, 1944. 0600 hours. The French port of Cherbourg still smouldered as the first convoy of German prisoners emerged from the rubble under morning fog. 347 men, ash-grey from exhaustion, hands raised above their heads. Some were Fallschirmjäger, who had fought street to street. Others were Wehrmacht infantry, pulled from coastal bunkers after 72 hours without sleep. They expected American infantry with rifles. They expected military police with batons. What they saw instead made several of them laugh out loud. Standing at the checkpoint, clipboard in hand, was a young woman in khaki uniform. Auburn hair tucked beneath a service cap. No sidearm, no rifle. Just a whistle on a lanyard and a fountain pen. Behind her, two more women directed traffic with white-gloved hands, guiding deuce-and-a-half trucks into formation like orchestra conductors. One prisoner, an Oberleutnant, with an iron cross still pinned to his torn tunic, turned to his sergeant and said in German, "They've sent their secretaries to collect us." The laughter rippled through the column. Bitter, exhausted laughter. The kind born from humiliation. Here they were, soldiers of the Reich, being processed like livestock by women who looked like they belonged behind typewriters in Berlin offices. The Oberleutnant muttered something crude. Others joined in. One called out in broken English, asking if the American army had run out of men. The woman with the clipboard didn't flinch. She made a notation, gestured to the next truck, and continued working. Her name was Lieutenant Margaret Hastings, Women's Army Corps, assigned to the 312th Quartermaster Battalion. She had been awake for 19 hours. This was her fourth prisoner convoy of the day. What those prisoners didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they were staring at the face of the machine that had already destroyed them. The convoy rolled east toward a transit camp outside Sainte-Mère-Église. 26 trucks, each carrying 15 to 20 prisoners, engines growling low under overcast sky. The roads were cratered from naval bombardment. Every few miles they passed burned-out vehicles, German and American both, pushed to the shoulder like discarded toys. The prisoners sat in silence now, swaying with the motion of the trucks, watching the countryside roll past. Some tried to sleep. Others stared at the women driving the vehicles. They were everywhere. At every checkpoint, every supply depot, every field kitchen that appeared along the road, there were women in uniform. Some wore the olive drab of the Women's Army Corps, others the British khaki of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. There were nurses in white armbands moving between ambulances, telephone operators stringing wire between poles, drivers manoeuvring 6x6 cargo trucks through muddy switchbacks with the precision of veteran haulers. One prisoner, a young corporal named Klaus Becker, kept staring at a woman directing traffic at a crossroads. She stood on an ammunition crate, arms moving in sharp, practice signals, routing convoys north and south without hesitation. She couldn't have been older than 22. Becker thought of his sister back in Heidelberg, who worked in a textile factory. He thought of the women in Germany, encouraged to stay home, to raise children, to embody the virtues of Kinder, Küche, Kirche. Children, kitchen, church. Here the women were running the war. The trucks pulled into the transit camp just after noon. It was massive. Row after row of tents stretched across a former pasture, each marked with white numbers painted on wooden stakes. There were latrines arranged in geometric precision. mess tents with steam rising from field kitchens, a medical station with a Red Cross banner snapping in the wind, and at the centre of it all, a command tent with radio antennas bristling like steel grass. The prisoners were unloaded, searched and processed. Personal effects were catalogued by women seated at folding tables beneath canvas awnings. Watches, pocket knives, photographs, letters from home, everything tagged, recorded and placed in manila envelopes. The efficiency was unsettling. There was no shouting, no chaos, just calm, methodical administration. Each prisoner was assigned a number, given a meal ticket and directed to a holding area. The Oberleutnant, who had mocked the women at Cherbourg, stood in line, watching. He noticed the woman processing his belongings wore a small bronze pin on her collar, a quartermaster insignia. She handled his iron cross without comment, wrapped it in cloth, sealed it in an envelope, and made a notation in her ledger. Her handwriting was immaculate. He asked her in careful English if she was a soldier. She looked up. Third Officer Patricia Lawson, Auxiliary Territorial Service, Quartermaster Corps. Next. He didn't move. You are British? Next, she repeated. A military policeman stepped forward and the Oberleutnant moved along. But the question lingered in his mind. If the British were using women as quartermaster officers, who was running their supply lines? Who was feeding their armies? That night, as the prisoners settled into their tents, the hum of the camp continued without pause. Generators rumbled, radios crackled, typewriters clattered from the command tent like distant machine gun fire. Someone was organising something vast and invisible, and it never stopped. The full scale of what they were witnessing didn't become clear until the third day. That morning, the prisoners were organised into work details. Not combat, not fortifications. Labour. They would be loading trucks, sorting supplies, moving crates under supervision. The guards made it clear. Cooperation meant better rations. Resistance meant isolation. Most of the prisoners complied. They were tired. The war was over for them. Becker's detail was assigned to a logistics depot 2 miles south of the camp. 30 men, 2 guards, and a convoy of empty trucks. The guards were both women. One was a staff sergeant from Iowa named Dorothy Kramer, Women's Army Corps, who carried a carbine across her back and moved with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 100 times. The other was a private named Evelyn Torres from Texas, who spoke fluent Spanish and passable German. The depot was staggering. It covered 20 acres. Row after row of wooden pallets stacked with crates, each marked with stenciled codes. There were tents the size of aircraft hangars filled with rations, ammunition, medical supplies, vehicle parts, tyres, jerry cans, blankets, boots, and boxes labelled in 3 languages. Forklifts moved between the rows like insects. Women operated most of them. A few men worked the heavier machinery, but the majority of the staff, clerks, inventory supervisors, loading crews, were women. Becker and his group were tasked with moving crates of sea rations onto waiting trucks. Each crate weighed 40 pounds. They worked in pairs, lifting and stacking under the watch of Sergeant Kramer, who made notations on a clipboard and directed the flow with hand signals. The work was hard, but not brutal. Every hour they were given water. At noon they were fed the same rations as the guards: corned beef hash, crackers, coffee. During the break, Becker sat on a crate and watched the depot operate. A woman in coveralls was repairing a truck engine, wrench in hand, grease on her forearms. Another was operating a fuel pump, filling jerry cans with mechanical precision. Near the command shack, 3 women hunched over maps spread across a folding table, discussing routes and tonnage, with the seriousness of general staff officers. One of the other prisoners, a veteran sergeant named Erich Vogel, sat beside Becker and said quietly, "They're not pretending." Becker looked at him. "They're not pretending to be soldiers," Vogel continued. "This is real. They're actually running this." Becker said nothing, but Vogel was right. There was no performance here, no symbolic gesture to boost morale back home. These women were operating a supply network with the scale and precision of a military campaign, and it was working. That night, back at the transit camp, the prisoners talked. Not loudly, not in groups, but in quiet conversations between bunks, the realization was spreading. The women weren't auxiliaries. They weren't volunteers brought in to free up men for combat. They were the system. They were the infrastructure. And that infrastructure was feeding an army of millions. In the weeks that followed, as the prisoners were transferred deeper into France and eventually across the Channel to camps in England, the evidence mounted. They saw women operating radio stations that coordinated convoys across 3 countries. They saw typing pools where 100 women processed requisition orders, personnel files, and intelligence reports with the speed and accuracy of machines. They saw field hospitals where nurses performed surgeries, administered blood transfusions, and saved lives under conditions that would have broken most men. One prisoner, a former logistics officer named Werner Stolz, was assigned to a work detail at a port in Southampton. His job was to help unload ships arriving from America. The ships came in every day, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. Liberty ships, Victory ships, tankers. Each one disgorged thousands of tons of cargo: tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, prefabricated bridges, entire field hospitals packed in crates. The unloading was orchestrated by a British captain named Eleanor Fitzroy, Auxiliary Territorial Service. She stood on the dock with a megaphone and a clipboard, directing cranes, assigning dock space, and tracking cargo with the efficiency of a railroad dispatcher. Stolz watched her for 3 days before he asked one of the other workers how long she had been doing this. The Panzers had run out of fuel. The Wehrmacht had run out of food. The Luftwaffe had run out of pilots. Germany had built a war machine that consumed faster than it could produce. The Allies had built something different. They had built an empire of supply, an industrial system so vast and so redundant that it could absorb losses, adapt to chaos, and keep feeding itself. And they had built it by using everyone, men and women, black and white, soldiers and civilians. They had turned their entire societies into engines of production, and Germany had lost before the first shot was fired. By autumn of 1944, the mockery had stopped entirely. The prisoners no longer laughed when women guards escorted them to work details. They no longer made jokes when women processed their mail or served their meals. They had learned, slowly and painfully, that the women in uniform were not symbols. They were professionals. They were the backbone of a machine that had crushed the Reich. One day in October, the Oberleutnant who had mocked Lieutenant Hastings at Cherbourg found himself back in her presence. he had been transferred to a permanent camp in the English Midlands, and she had been reassigned there as well, now a captain overseeing prisoner labour assignments. She didn't recognise him. Why would she? She had processed thousands of prisoners, but he recognised her. He stood at attention when she entered the barracks to deliver an announcement about new work schedules. He listened as she explained in clear and measured English the expectations and the consequences of non-compliance. When she finished, she asked if there were any questions. The Oberleutnant raised his hand. She nodded at him. "Captain," he said carefully, "how many prisoners are in this camp?" 3,216, she replied without hesitation. "And how many camps like this are there?" She paused, studying him. "In the United Kingdom, 237. In France, more than 500. In the United States, more than 600. The Oberleutnant did the math in his head. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Millions of tons of supplies, thousands of camps, depots, hospitals, and logistics hubs. And women were running substantial portions of it. "Thank you, Captain," he said quietly. She nodded and left. The barracks was silent. That night, the Oberleutnant sat on his bunk and wrote a letter to his wife in Bavaria. He knew it would be read by censors. He knew it might not reach her for months. But he wrote it anyway. He told her about the women he had seen, the drivers, the clerks, the officers. He told her they were not weak. They were not soft. They were not playing at war. They were waging it in their own way, and they were winning. He told her that Germany had lost because it had fought the 20th century with 19th century ideas, that it had clung to myths of blood and soil, while the Allies had embraced industry and equality, that the Reich had sent its women home to bear children, while the democracies had sent their women to build the future. He didn't know if she would understand. He didn't know if he fully understood it himself, but he knew with a certainty that ached in his chest that the world had changed, and Germany had been on the wrong side of history. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By then, more than 150,000 American women had served in the Women's Army Corps. More than 200,000 British women had served in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Tens of thousands more had served in Nursing Corps, transport units, Signal Corps, and intelligence services across the Allied nations. They had driven trucks through blizzards. They had operated switchboards under bombardment. They had decoded enemy messages, administered blood transfusions, and kept supply lines open across 2 continents. They had done this without glory, without recognition, and often without thanks. And the German prisoners had watched. Some of them carried that knowledge home. When they returned to the rubble of German cities, to the shattered economy and the shame of defeat, they carried with them the memory of women in uniform operating machinery, commanding logistics, and running the war machine that had destroyed the Reich. It was a memory that would haunt them, not because it was painful, but because it was undeniable. They had laughed at the idea of women soldiers. And the women had fed, clothed, transported, and organized the army that buried the Third Reich beneath the weight of industrial civilization. There is a photograph that survives from that summer. June 1944. A prisoner of war camp somewhere in Normandy. In the foreground, a young German corporal sits on the ground, hands on his knees, staring at nothing. In the background, slightly out of focus, a woman in American uniform walks past carrying a clipboard. She is not looking at him. She is looking ahead, toward the next task, the next convoy, the next 1,000 details that keep an army alive. The corporal's face is unreadable. Exhaustion, perhaps, or shame, or the dawning realization that everything he had been taught was a lie. The photograph has no caption. It doesn't need one, because the story it tells is written in the gap between them, between the soldier who believed in hierarchy and blood, and the woman who believed in work, between the army that sent its women home and the army that sent its women to war, between the Reich that promised 1,000 years and the democracy that built 1,000 supply depots, between the laughter of arrogance and the silence of defeat. That silence echoes still, not in the grand battles or the famous speeches, but in the quiet hum of logistics tents and the steady rhythm of typewriters. In the memory of women who wore uniforms and carried clipboards and ran the machinery of liberation. They did not fire the guns, but they loaded them. They did not fly the bombers, but they fueled them. They did not sign the treaties, but they won the war. And the prisoners who laughed learned too late that history does not belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who build the longest roads, feed the largest armies, and turn the wheels of civilization forward, one convoy at a time. The women of the Allied Logistics Corps did not ask for monuments. They built them instead, not in marble, but in the rubble of fascism, not in stone, but in the foundations of a world that would never again mistake quiet competence for weakness. And that world, built in part by their hands, endures.